Okay, so again, Harley Schlanger will speak next, and then we will have a Q&A period. So people, if you begin to have questions brewing, just remember that we will have a Q&A session here. And so this evening's panel will conclude with Harley Schlanger, who in some ways, for many of you, probably doesn't need an introduction, but Harley has been working with LaRouche for many decades now and has been the West Coast spokesman, but really a spokesman for the nation, a real national leader in the movement. Has also played a crucial role as a kind of mentor within the policy committee that Michael Steger and I are a part of, along with Rachel Brown, Bill Roberts, Keisha Rogers, and Diane Sayre. So anyway, but I think also just the international role that Harley has played as well in terms of organizing networks in Europe and so forth. So I think I'll just leave it at that, and people just welcome Harley here. So.
Well, I think most of you know that we're several days away from an annual holiday in the United States, July 4th. And I think if the theme of this conference is to be real and carried with us after this day is over, it should be to have this living memory of the importance of the American Revolution in all of us. And I have to say I'm delighted with the progress in this conference where we've had people speaking from China, from Australia, and from Europe about the profound importance of the American Revolution. And this is, I think, should be highlighted further by the fact that we're now on the verge, I believe it was 150 years ago, that the Battle of Gettysburg, which in a sense was part of the Second American Revolution, or the continuation of the First American Revolution, took place. And so these should not just be days of drinking and barbecue and kicking off the shoes and sitting in the sun, although these days the sun's a little too hot in most of the country. But they should be days where these ideas become totally real, that the discussion of these questions of life and death for our nation, of stopping genocide globally, because there's no question that what Lynn presented today, he's serious, and he knows what he's talking about when he says that we're facing a moment where a collapse could bring on immediately a disintegration of nations that would lead to chaos and mass death. So we're not just talking about honoring the past, we're talking about having it be real in us so that we bequeath to future generations the benefits that we've had from those who went before us. Now, I'm sure that many of you have had this experience in recent times where you're talking to someone about important things and you bring up Glass-Steagall and they have a sort of a blank look on their face. Or they may have some vague recollection of what you're talking about. But I'm sure also those of you who have been organizing have seen how this has changed. That people are now talking about Glass-Steagall, that it's becoming a living issue. And that since the July 25, 2007 webcast of Lyndon LaRouche, when he accurately forecast the end of this banking system, and I should just tell you that when Lynn says the end of this banking system, what he identified on that day is true. This banking system is dead. It's gone. They can't save it. They can kill all of us, but they can't save the banking system. And Lynn was accurate. But when he made that forecast and put forward an alternative, initially the Homeowner and Bank Protection Act, and then revival of Glass-Steagall, most people were saying, well, but that's so 20th century. That's FDR. Who remembers FDR? We're in a new era. This is a new time for mankind. Well, we've made this the center of the fight. And in bringing together those who oppose the current policy, and let's be honest here. Who in this country likes the direction of this country? How could you? It's horrifying what we're seeing. What we're doing is bringing together a lot of frustrated people, angry people, demoralized people, and giving them a sense of what is in their own DNA. And as we see, not just the DNA of Americans, but also of Chinese, of Australians, and others, that there are principles above party, principles which embody fundamental human values and universal principles that are those which should motivate us to act. Now, we've seen it with the H.R. 129, the Marcy Kaptur bill, which Walter Jones is a co-sponsor. We're beginning to get Republican co-sponsors of this. You know, the Republicans have some problems on this, but to be fair, so do the Democrats. Their main problem is that they're corrupt, they're cowardly, and they need to see a population inspired by these ideas. We saw it with Harkin's bill in the Senate. We've seen it now with 22 state legislatures, which have introduced the Glass-Steagall resolution. But I want to just bring a couple of greetings to this conference from people that represent this kind of broad potential coalition, one of whom some of you may remember as a comedian, Roseanne Barr, who sent greetings to this conference. She was a candidate for the Peace and Freedom Party for president in the last election. And she tends to be very concise and succinct. She said, "I send my greetings to the Schiller Institute conference. We need to stick a pin in the bankster balloon. Glass-Steagall is the way." We have a statement also from a Colorado state senator, a Republican, who introduced Glass-Steagall in the Colorado legislature. And he said, "Restoring Glass-Steagall is an all-important step we must take. It is not a Republican or a Democratic issue. It is not a liberal, conservative, or libertarian issue. It is simply common sense that well-functioning markets have to appropriately align risk and reward so that no one can gamble with taxpayers' money." So that's from State Senator Owen Hill from the 10th District of Colorado. And then I have a greetings also. It's a longer greetings, but I'll just reference it. It's from someone who's become a friend of mine who was very active in the Ron Paul campaign, who has a blog, a website called the SGT Report, and he's dedicating himself to bringing the anti-Fed movement into something more substantial, namely the movement for Glass-Steagall, the credit system, and NWAPA. And that's from Sean G. Turnbull from Minneapolis, who runs the SGT Report. Now, I just bring you these examples to show you that we're beginning to get traction in political institutional layers among bankers, but also among people who have come to recognize the importance of their political action. But the important thing is that we as a movement, the LaRouche movement, we intend to win this fight. We know what's at stake. This is not about bringing corrupt bankers to justice alone. It's not about a technical means. It's about restoring to our nation these higher principles. And when we do win this fight, there will be no more bailouts. There will be no more bail-ins. The only reference to the word bail will be what the bankers will have to post when they're indicted for their criminal activity. Now, I better get to my topic, which is the full original intent of Glass-Steagall, as Lyndon LaRouche has insisted. And to do it, I want to take a look at California now without Glass-Steagall compared to what California was when Glass-Steagall was the law. And we've had some very useful discussion on the agriculture and water crisis, so I'll try not to repeat what has been presented before us. But take a look at the state of California today. We've gone through a perpetual budget crisis, annual revenue shortfalls, budget cuts from 2002 to today to over $120 billion. And you hear this talk, well, there's too much pork, there's too much spending. It's all nonsense. What's been done with these cuts is targeting the poor, the elderly, the sick, and children, and the future. Because when you cut health care, the way it's been done in this state, and the way Barack Obama's genocidal Obamacare policy is already doing, with Medicare cuts, Medicaid cuts, threats to Social Security, you're killing people. We're not talking about 10 years from now people will die. They're already dead. Elderly people, people who couldn't get to emergency rooms because hospitals were shut down, people who die because of police and fire cuts, food inspection cuts, loss of food production, and so on. And the collapse of education, which is denying children access to their real potential through their imagination. We had a governor in this state, Arnie Schwarzenegger. How did that happen? You know, a guy can't even speak English. Of course, Bush became president, so I guess you don't have to speak English to be elected. Schwarzenegger's big theme, government is the problem. And people bought this. Maybe it's because of the cult of celebrity that we've all fallen for. Now we have a governor who's recycled, which is appropriate since he's one of the big recycling advocates. Jerry Brown. We once had a pamphlet, if it's brown, flush it. And that's true today. Now, every step of the way that California collapsed, our movement has fought it. California and the nation, because it's been a common policy. We fought the two leading elements that brought on the deindustrialization, which have caused the budget crises and the collapse of production. One is the greenie movement, the so-called environmentalist movement, and the other is the fight against deregulation. Now, California, for its budget, depends on revenue from two sources mainly: capital gains taxes on wealthy people and sales tax, and then secondly, various kinds of bubbles. That wasn't the way it used to be. This used to be a state of industry, of agriculture, of infrastructure, of innovation, of trade, of expansion. But all of that changed. And in the recent years, we saw income go up when the bubble started, like the dot-com bubble, and then the revenue to the state collapse and the cuts coming in. And then after 2007, the same thing happened with the collapse of the housing bubble. So today, the politicians in Sacramento say, oh, we've balanced the budget. Well, it's a smaller budget because they've already admitted they're going to kill certain people. And it's also, there's some money coming into the state. Why? Because of new bubbles. You know, some of you may remember when Facebook went public, Governor Brown said this will be great because California will have a whole bunch of new millionaires made by Facebook stock, and they'll pay, when they sell the stock, they'll pay taxes and our revenue will go up. Isn't that great? You have your children's education, your parents' health care dependent on a bunch of people lying to each other about who they are on the internet, with the NSA watching every step of the way, as we now know. There's an economic policy for you. Now also, they're touting tech jobs. We're getting new tech jobs in California. You know what the leading tech job in California is? App development. I just want to read you something from a paper from the Public Policy Institute, considered one of the leading economic think tanks in California. There's a growth in this area because of media and communication workers, including social network developers, that points the way to the future, including special network developers, public relations jobs, filling positions in digital and internet economy. And here's an example they gave. A parking lot company in Los Angeles is hiring a social media specialist to use social networks, pop culture, and social media trends to increase monthly parking at their site. I'm just reporting it. Now, what was it that built California into a great economic power, to at one point being supposedly the 5th largest economy in the world if it were a nation? Now, by the way, it's 9th. And it's fallen behind countries that in the Eurozone that are already collapsed. So that tells you about the great effects of Schwarzenegger, Brown, and also the Bush administrations and the Obama administration. Well, the myth is that California was built by Hollywood. That's a Hollywood myth. The reality is that it was the New Deal, the Franklin Roosevelt policy, starting with Glass-Steagall, which created the basis for one of the most spectacular booming economies on sound principles in world history. With Glass-Steagall, you also had the infrastructure policies, which in California included the effects of the Hoover Dam. It included many public works projects, the WPA, the PWA, the CCC, and so on, that put people to work doing things that created something. Not the so-called Obama stimulus, which largely hired people to figure out where the stimulus money was going, but hiring people and teaching them skills, putting them to work in this. Now, this Roosevelt 1930s buildup was just the prelude to the real deal, which was the buildup during the wartime. I'm just going to give you a few figures just to give you a sense of this. But between 1940 and 1946, the federal government spent $35 billion in California, second only to what was spent in New York and Michigan. And in Franklin Roosevelt's terms, the arsenal of democracy, that is the ability to build the machinery needed to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese Empire, was not just Detroit, but Los Angeles. Los Angeles was the second most industrialized city in the country. Did you know that? It's not just tan lines and boob jobs. It actually had a productive base to it. Now, secondly, during the period 1940 to 46, the manufacturing economy in California increased by a factor of 2.5, 250% increase in manufacturing jobs. Average income during that period tripled, 300% increase in income. And 1.6 million people moved to California from around the country to work in defense-related industries. Now, in the 40s in California, in addition to auto, steel, and rubber, you had the advance of the machine tool sector, which is connected to the auto industry, but also shipbuilding up in the Bay Area in particular, and aerospace down in Southern California. Now, nationally, between 1942 and 1944, under Roosevelt's policies, we had a 1,000% increase in machine tool production. Not only did they increase the number of machine tools, but the power of those machine tools increased as the war went on, so that you had a second-order improvement in the productivity of labor through that kind of investment. In 1944, there were 230,000 men and women working in aviation in Los Angeles County, in the aerospace sector. This is what built California. The combination of the water projects and other infrastructure projects in the 30s, the investment policy, and then the war mobilization, which couldn't have happened without Glass-Steagall and without the FDR 1930s policies. Between 1940 and 1950, California's population grew by 53%, from 6.9 million to 10.6 million. It's a huge increase. Now, this kind of economic development continued at the end of the 1950s, largely because of water problems. You had what Dr. Cooper pointed out, plenty of water in Northern California and none in Southern California. And you had a governor elected, Pat Brown, who said, look, California doesn't have a water problem. It just got water in the wrong places. We've just got to move it. Now, I want you to just listen to some quotes from some people involved in establishing the California Water Project, just to give you a sense of the kind of thinking then compared to now. In his campaigns for governor in 1958, Governor Brown used a rhetorical question to end a lot of his speeches. He said, should corporate interests and nature run their course at your expense, or should the government solve the water problem? He was referring in part to flooding that killed 64 people in 1955. But this reference to corporations, corporate cartels, and nature, the idea that nature was a problem, that we have to do something with nature. One of his top advisors during the campaign said, by bringing water to the thirsty land, you were in effect doing the Lord's work. And when Brown was criticized by spending money to do these water projects, he sent a letter to the press, a letter to the editor. He didn't like the way the press was covering it. And he said, well, what are we to do? Build barriers around California and say nobody else can come in because we don't have enough water to go around? And it was in the late 50s and early 60s that the full Central Valley Water Project was completed, work done on the Imperial Canal, the All-American Canal, and California agriculture grew to the point that it became the largest source of agricultural production in the country, as we heard from Frank Endres earlier. That's how California grew. Now, not only that, but one other aspect of the Brown policy was funding and education. If someone could get a high enough quality grades in high school, they could go to state schools for almost nothing. And the president of the University of California said in 1958, we want to bring workers, attract workers to California, attract industry to California, not by having cheap labor, but by having skilled, productive, educated workers. Now, just to review again why this thing collapsed, it happened over successive decades. Going back to the Nixon 1971 policy that Lyndon LaRouche identified that created floating exchange rates and had severe damage to the U.S. industrial economy, especially as it was a step forward to free trade and a speculative economy. The deindustrialization that resulted in the 70s and 80s, the expansion of real estate bubbles, which happen every couple of years in California, and then the decline of the aerospace. In the 70s and 80s, it was the auto industry that was shut down. In the 80s, it was the aerospace sector after 1989. Instead of going with Lyndon LaRouche's SDI concept, which was a scientific basis for developing not just anti-missile systems, but new technologies based on new physical principles. Instead, they shut it down. And at the same time, the counterculture took over California. The so-called tech revolution, the personal computer came from a bunch of acid heads working for DARPA. I once wrote a piece called From Hippies to Hedge Funds. You can look it up. The drug culture, the celebrity culture, and the infantilization of the population to the focus on the self rather than what Victor just presented about acting for the good of the other as a philosophical principle. So in the late 70s, 50,000 high-wage jobs left Southern California. In the 80s, we saw the loss of millions of jobs in California. 1.3 million manufacturing jobs were left in 2009, but it was a 21% drop from 2005. California lost 81,000 manufacturing jobs in 2008 alone. And between 2000 and 2009, California lost 471,000 manufacturing jobs. And let me just finish with one quote from the Green Revolution. The California Central Valley, the most productive agricultural area in the country, lost 150 billion gallons of water to protect a fish. A fish that was too stupid to swim to another stream. And that took 85,000 acres of useful farmland out of production. So what we're looking at is a real collapse. When you talk about these jobs, you're talking about families being destroyed. You're talking about people losing homes, tax collection collapsing except for on the extremes because people aren't working. And now a killing policy, an admitted killing policy. As someone from the European Union told Helga, 66, that should be the extent of life. After that, you're on your own. Now, all of this should bring us back then to the theme of this conference. Most people in this room are Americans. Now, Americans include people from all over the world. We have a very diverse culture. People came here because of the freedoms that were enshrined in our founding documents. And yet most people have no idea what those are. And that those principles in those documents represent the salvation for our country and for themselves. And so when we go out of here after this conference, We have to take these ideas with us, starting with the most basic, which is that with Glass-Steagall, we get back to the principles of physical economy on which this nation was based. And this is the path to justice, because with Glass-Steagall, you end the bailouts and the bail-ins, and you begin the potential for rebuilding, as we've outlined in our three-part policy, which includes the credit system, which is necessary, because once you get rid of all this debt, you're going to find that the banks have nothing in it. And we've got to start figuring out a way to put production back together, and the infrastructure policies are the key to that. Now, can we do it? Well, our whole nation has been, as Robbie said, this question of ironies and anomalies. We beat the biggest power in the world to form a nation. We beat them again in 1812, and we beat them again in the 1860s. And now we're rolling over and surrendering to them with the Bush administrations and with Obama. But that's not the American way. And as Lyndon LaRouche demonstrates what an American is, you fight for principle no matter what the odds. The other day, Lynn said, "I'd rather be right than be successful." Now, a lot of people think that goes against the American way because success is everything, right? No, if you're right and you stick to it and you never back down, but you always are open to ideas on how to express that and how to communicate it, then ultimately you will be successful. Thank you.